They said the war was fought in the skies. But the truth is, some of its greatest battles were fought in silence, inside factories that never saw the sun. In 1942, the air above Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. Allied bombers tried to push through the iron ceiling over Berlin, but they never made it far enough. Their escort fighters ran out of range long before the target. Pilots called it the invisible wall, a line beyond which no one came back. While generals drew arrows on maps and engineers argued over blueprints, far from the front, a boy swept metal shavings off the factory floor. His name was Eli Turner. He was 17. He wasn't a soldier, not even an apprentice engineer. Just another anonymous set of hands in the endless hum of North American aviation, where the air smelled of aluminum dust and burnt oil, where every hammer strike echoed like a heartbeat of a nation trying to keep up. Outside, the headlines spoke of Blitzkrieg and Stalingrad, but inside that hangar, the war had a different rhythm. It was the rhythm of rivet guns, drafting pencils, and engines being born. Eli liked to draw, not people, not scenery, but shapes that looked like they wanted to fly. He drew on the backs of shipping manifests, on cigarette cartons, on whatever paper the foreman threw away. His sketches were messy, covered in oil stains, but they had a strange grace, lines that curved just enough to make sense to the eye, even if they defied the textbooks. He had heard the engineers talk about laminar flow. It was the obsession of the moment, a kind of airflow that could make wings slice through the sky with almost no drag, but no one had quite figured it out. The meetings were endless. The drafts were thrown away. The Mustang, they said, had promise. If only the wing could breathe right. One afternoon, during a rare pause between shifts, Eli found a discarded set of blueprints half covered in dust near the back of the drafting room. The lines were clean, technical, cold. Yet he felt something missing. He took a pencil stub from his pocket, traced the edge of the wing on a spare scrap of paper, then changed one curve. Just one. It was barely noticeable, a deeper arc along the lower surface, subtle enough that only an artist's eye might see it. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe imagination. Maybe he was simply tired of sweeping the same floor while others tried to invent the impossible. But when he lifted his pencil, the sketch looked right. It looked alive. Later that day, a gust of wind from the open hangar door blew his drawing off the workbench. It landed near a young engineer named Tom Reeves, who bent down to pick it up. "You drew this?" he asked. Eli hesitated. "Just a doodle, sir." Reeves studied it for a moment, then chuckled softly. "Well, your doodle's wrong, but it's wrong in an interesting way." He folded the paper, slipped it into his jacket, and walked away. Eli thought that was the end of it. But a few nights later, in the small test tunnel on the far side of the plant, the air started to move. A low, steady roar as they tested another scale model. Eli wasn't supposed to be there, but curiosity got the better of him. From the shadows, he watched the engineers stare at the pressure gauges, whispering among themselves. The numbers didn't make sense. Drag had dropped. The airflow had changed. No one said a word about the sketch. Not that night, not ever. But in the following weeks, a new blueprint began to circulate. The lower curve of the Mustang's wing, slightly altered, almost imperceptible, and though no one could explain how, the aircraft suddenly breathed smoother through the air, climbed cleaner, flew farther. Eli kept sweeping floors. He kept drawing. He never asked questions. But sometimes, when the prototype engine started and the hangar filled with that deep metallic hum, he would pause, close his eyes, and feel, for just a second, that the sound carried something of his own heartbeat. Outside, snow was falling over Los Angeles, soft and almost unreal. The war was far away, but inside the factory, the wind of it was everywhere. brushing against the paper, whispering through aluminum ribs, rising in the endless song of creation. And on one corner of a cluttered desk, under a pile of forgotten drafts, a small scrap of paper waited, a pencil line shimmering faintly under the yellow light, like the trace of a wing about to take flight. By early 1943, the war had turned into a contest of endurance. Factories against factories, minds against exhaustion. Every machine that left the assembly line carried not just bolts and rivets, but fragments of faith. In Inglewood, California, the North American aviation plant ran 20 hours a day. The air inside was a blend of hot metal and cold ambition. Over 200,000 components were needed for a single aircraft, and each rivet meant one more hope that maybe, just maybe, this one would turn the tide. Eli Turner still swept the same floor, though by now he'd learned how to move unnoticed through the chaos. He'd memorized the rhythm of the hangar, the cough of compressors, the click of drafting tools, the way conversations shifted when a new test failed. Sometimes he paused by the wind tunnel, a narrow steel throat built to simulate the sky. He wasn't supposed to look, but he couldn't help it. The roar drew him in. On the far side of the glass, engineers in white coats watched the smoke streams bend around a small wooden model of a Mustang. The air should have been smooth, clean laminar flow, but instead the smoke lines rippled like disturbed water. Drag. Instability. Always the same problem. That night, when the technicians went home, Eli lingered. The door to the tunnel room had been left ajar. Inside, on a drafting table, he saw the same blueprint he'd seen weeks before, now altered slightly. The curve beneath the wing, once sharp, was softer, familiar. His breath caught. It was his line. A voice behind him broke the silence. "You again." It was Reeves, the young engineer who'd found his sketch. He wasn't angry, just curious. "You've been watching our tests, haven't you?" Eli nodded. "I didn't mean to." Reeves waved it off. "Don't worry. You see, half of this war is mistakes that turn out to be useful. You made one of those." He gestured to the tunnel. "We ran your curve. At first, the data looked wrong. Airflow too clean, lift coefficient off the charts. But then we rechecked. Turns out your wrong drawing cut drag by almost 15%. It shouldn't work. But it does." Eli stared through the glass at the wooden model trembling under the wind. The idea that a line he drew, one curve on scrap paper, could ripple into something that might save pilots' lives was almost too much to grasp. Reeves lowered his voice. "Listen, kid. Officially, this never happened. There's no room for janitors in engineering history. But I'm not blind. What you did, it might change how our boys fly home." For a long moment, the only sound was the hiss of the tunnel slowing down. The wind faded, and silence filled the room, heavy, almost sacred. In the weeks that followed, production ramped up. The modified wing, codenamed Model B, Revision 3LF, went quietly into testing. No press releases, no signatures, just a silent correction on the factory floor. Pilots who flew the first prototypes noted how the aircraft felt, lighter in the climb, smoother in the turn. By summer, the RAF test pilots in Duxford confirmed it. The Mustang now had a range of over 1,600 miles, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Eli didn't know those numbers. He only knew that one morning, a small group of officers in dark coats toured the factory, shaking hands, nodding gravely. He saw Reeves among them, eyes tired but proud. Later that night, when the hangar was empty, Eli stood alone near the newest Mustang fuselage. Its metal skin gleamed under the low light, like the surface of a sleeping animal. He reached out, brushed his fingertips along the curve of the wing, his curve, and for a second, the cold aluminum felt warm. From somewhere outside, the faint rumble of another test flight echoed across the distance. The sound was steady, confident. A sound that belonged to the sky. Eli smiled faintly, not because anyone would ever know, but because somewhere, high above the clouds, a pilot might be flying just a little safer, a little freer, because of one forgotten line on a piece of paper. And as he turned off the lights, the hum of the hangar lingered behind him, low and eternal, like the breath of a sleeping giant waiting for dawn. By autumn of 1943, the war had become both distant and intimate. A headline one moment, a telegram the next. The factory kept Eli humming, always humming. The metallic heartbeat of a nation that refused to rest. The smell of hot oil and ozone clung to every shirt, every thought. For most men there, the sound of rivet guns was ordinary. For Eli Turner, it was the sound of destiny tightening its bolts. He had stopped sweeping near the wind tunnel. Reeves's warning still echoed in his head. Officially, this never happened. But even from across the hangar, he could tell which blueprints had changed. The new wings looked different now. Not drastic, just right. When he looked at them, he felt the quiet pride of someone who'd built a bridge and watched others cross it without knowing his name. One evening, a plane taxied out under the orange glow of the California sunset. The first Mustang fitted entirely with the new wing. The men gathered to watch, faces streaked with sweat and soot, caps pulled low. Reeves stood at the front, clipboard in hand, his expression tight. Eli lingered farther back, half hidden behind a crate of aluminum sheets. The test pilot, a tall man with a calm gait, climbed into the cockpit. The propeller spun once, twice. Then the roar of the Merlin engine filled the air, sharp and pure. The aircraft rolled forward, lifted easily from the runway, and climbed with an elegance that drew a collective breath from the ground crew. "She flies like she's made of thought," Reeves murmured, almost to himself. Eli watched until the plane became a glint of silver against the blue. He didn't cheer. He only listened to the receding hum that carried his secret away. Weeks passed. Production intensified. The Mustang's new design was sent overseas, first in fragments, then in fleets. Reports came back from England, escort missions reaching Berlin, bomber losses cut nearly in half, Luftwaffe interceptors struggling to close in. Every victory was celebrated with numbers and headlines. None of them mentioned the janitor. Then, one gray morning in January 1944, a letter arrived at the factory, addressed to Mr. Eli Turner. It bore the seal of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The envelope was thick, the kind used for official commendations. His hands trembled as he turned it over. For a second he imagined the impossible, that someone had noticed, that his name had somehow slipped through the cracks. But when he opened it, the words inside stole his breath for another reason entirely. It wasn't a commendation. It was a notice. His brother, Samuel Turner, Staff Sergeant 91st Bomb Group, had been declared missing in action over Germany. His B-17 had not returned from a mission near Bremen. The letter was brief, polite, final. That night, the factory lights felt harsher. The machinery sounded colder. He could no longer hear the rhythm that once kept him moving. Each hammer strike echoed like a clock counting down. Reeves found him sitting alone near the assembly floor, the unopened lunchbox beside him. "You got word?" Eli nodded. "They say missing, but we both know what that means." Reeves hesitated, then sat beside him. The two men watched sparks fall from the welding line like fleeting stars. "He flew one of ours, didn't he?" Reeves asked softly. Eli stared ahead. "Yeah, one of the new ones." The thought hit both of them at once. Sharp, silent, unbearable. His brother had vanished in the sky, shaped by his own hand. For days after, Eli worked mechanically, his movements dull and slow. The pride he once carried now weighed like iron. But grief, like pressure, can forge something stronger. He began to return to the wind tunnel at night, not to sketch, not to hide, but to think. He studied the airflow patterns Reeves had left behind. He saw flaws others missed, micro-vibrations near the leading edge, a subtle imbalance in lift during high-speed dives. Nothing fatal, but enough to matter when lives hung in the air. He couldn't bring his brother back, but he could make sure the next man had a better chance. By spring, quiet improvements had spread through the blueprints again. Unauthorized, unsigned, a new reinforcement under the aileron, a minor adjustment to the cooling intake. Tiny things, invisible things. Yet every one of them made the aircraft a little more forgiving, a little safer when the wind turned cruel. No one ever asked who'd done it. No one ever knew. And sometimes, late at night, as he swept the floor for the last shift, Eli would look up toward the dark ceiling of the hangar and imagine a single plane flying home through the blackness. Steady, unwavering, its wings catching the moonlight in just the right way. Like it had been drawn that way all along. By the summer of 1944, the air above Europe was no longer a place of domination. It was a contest of endurance. The Luftwaffe, once untouchable, had become desperate, and the Allied airfields were running at full strain. Engines ran day and night, and mechanics slept in the sound of propellers. Yet amid the smoke and victory banners, something quieter endured. The perfection of a single-wing design, drawn once by a janitor no one remembered. Back in Inglewood, the factory had become a city in itself. Thousands of workers, men and women alike, filled the hangars. They moved like clockwork, each motion feeding the war machine. Overhead cranes swung with the slow grace of beasts of burden. Sparks painted constellations on the walls. And somewhere in the middle of it all, broom in hand, sleeves rolled, was Eli Turner. No one looked twice anymore. He blended into the rhythm, his uniform no different than the next man's, his eyes fixed not on the ground he swept, but on the wings that passed above him on steel rails. He didn't need credit. He just needed to know they were flying. But one morning, a visiting officer from the Army Air Forces arrived, a young major with the crisp manner of someone who'd seen too much, too fast. His name was Major Collins, and he had come from the 8th Air Force headquarters in England. He toured the factory floor with Reeves, clipboard in hand, jotting notes as he went. When they reached the assembly line, Collins stopped. His gaze lingered on one of the new Mustangs, its polished aluminum reflecting the morning light like liquid glass. "This one's from the updated production batch, isn't it?" he asked. Reeves nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir. Slight reinforcement on the ailerons. Better airflow under compression." Collins smiled faintly. "We've noticed. Pilots call it the forgiving wing. Says it feels alive at high speed, like it wants to come home." Eli, sweeping a few feet away, froze mid-motion. The word struck something deep. Simple. Impossible. True. The major continued, unaware of the man standing just behind him. "Had a squadron return last week after a long run to Berlin. Took flak, lost formation, but one plane made it back with half its tail gone. Pilot said the wings held her steady all the way to the channel. Called it a miracle." He paused, running a hand along the curve of the wing. "If you ask me, that's not a miracle. That's good engineering." Reeves smiled thinly, saying nothing. But his eyes flicked, once, toward Eli. When the officer left, Reeves walked over. For a moment, neither man spoke. The factory clamor filled the space between them. Finally, Reeves said quietly, "They're calling it the forgiving wing. Seems fitting, don't you think?" Eli nodded once, not trusting his voice. His hands gripped the broom handle until the wood creaked. That night, the hangar was empty, but for the low hum of cooling metal. Eli walked the rows of finished aircraft, running his fingers along their wings. Smooth, cold, perfect. He paused by one, its tail freshly painted with a white star and blue circle. On the nose, in neat stencil, someone had written, "Lucky Lady." He smiled, a small, private smile, and placed his palm flat against the metal. "Fly straight," he whispered, "and bring them home." Outside, thunder rumbled distantly, though the sky was clear. Somewhere across the ocean, that same sound echoed. The sound of a Mustang diving, leveling, climbing again. Pilots felt it in their bones, though they couldn't explain why this plane moved differently, why it steadied itself when others might have fallen apart. By the time word of D-Day reached the factory, production was at a fever pitch. The Mustang was no longer an experiment. It was the escort of victory. Every bomber that reached Berlin, every pilot that made it home through the dark, owed a debt to a line drawn in graphite on a stolen blueprint. But history doesn't keep ledgers for men like Eli Turner. It remembers generals, pilots, and victories, not janitors with calloused hands and quiet eyes. Still, sometimes, when the night shift ended and the sun began to rise over the hangar roofs, the light would catch the wings in such a way that the metal seemed to breathe. And for a fleeting moment, it felt as if the sky itself remembered who had drawn the line that let it fly. And then, as always, the day began again. And the man with the broom kept walking. By late autumn of 1944, the war machine was reaching its brutal rhythm. Factories worked without pause. Engines screamed from England to Burma. And inside the North American aviation plant at Inglewood, something like exhaustion had become a way of life. Men spoke less. The smell of oil and sweat clung to the walls. Riveters counted their shifts, not in hours, but in aircraft completed. Each week, another squadron left the hangar doors, polished, armed, baptized by flight. And each week, a few names quietly disappeared from the bulletin board at the end of the line. Eli Turner had stopped marking the days. He lived somewhere between the clang of metal and the hiss of acetylene, between blueprints and silence. The world beyond those hangar walls, Normandy, Arnhem, Bastogne, came to him only through static-laden radio broadcasts. The voices said words like advance, counterattack, losses, victory. They all blurred together. What didn't blur was the wing. His wing. One morning, a draft rolled through the open factory doors, a chill that carried the smell of rain and exhaust. A crate had arrived from the front, marked damaged components, return for analysis. Most of the men ignored it. They'd seen dozens before. But Reeves called Eli over. "Take a look at this," the engineer said, prying open the lid. Inside lay a twisted section of aluminum, blackened at the edges, its surface riddled with bullet scars. It was part of a Mustang's right wing. Reeves tilted it to the light. "This one flew out of Debden Field, took heavy flak. Pilot made it back." He traced a finger along a still visible curve of metal. Smooth, unbroken despite the damage. "Held together longer than it should have. I thought you'd want to see it." Eli didn't move at first. Then he reached out, brushing his thumb across the surface. Underneath the soot, faintly visible, was a line, not drawn, but pressed. A shallow groove from an old drafting stylus. His stylus. He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. "It's the same batch," he murmured. "The modified ribs. They held." Reeves looked at him. Not with pity, but with something like pride. "We sent an improved version of your curvature to Wright Field. They're using it in production now. You should know that." Eli didn't answer. For a long moment he just stared at the fragment. Metal warped by war, yet still carrying the ghost of a drawing made in secret 2 years before. That night, he didn't go home. The hangar was silent except for the low hum of distant generators. He sat at a drafting table long since abandoned, one of the few places where the air still smelled of paper instead of oil. He pulled out a single sheet, yellowed, folded and began to draw again. This time, it wasn't a wing. It was a cross-section of the entire aircraft. Cleaner, lighter, faster. He penciled numbers in the margins, erased, redrew. The movements were slow but deliberate, like a prayer. And when the dawn crept through the hangar windows, the first light caught the graphite lines, making them shine faintly, like the glint of a blade. He rolled up the page, tied it with twine, and tucked it inside an envelope. On the front, he wrote, "For those who build, not those who command." Then he placed it on Reeves's desk. No signature. Weeks later, a test pilot at Muroc Army Airfield would take a prototype into the sky. A model labeled P-51H, the final evolution of the Mustang line. Lighter frame, higher altitude, faster climb. The engineers would note improvements in lift and roll response, but couldn't fully explain why. Someone had altered the internal geometry of the wing spars during drafting. When asked, Reeves only said, "It was already there. We just never noticed." By the winter of 1945, Europe was burning its last fuel. The Reich was collapsing, the skies belonged to the Allies, and thousands of Mustangs now crossed the Channel each day. The sound of their engines, that deep, layered growl, became the anthem of an ending. In Inglewood, the factory slowed. For the first time in years, silence began to return. One evening, as Reeves locked up the floor, he noticed something carved faintly into the concrete near the assembly line. It was small, almost invisible beneath a layer of dust and shoe prints. He knelt and traced it with his finger. A single initial. E.T. He smiled, half in disbelief, half in respect. "Damn it, Turner," he whispered. "You really did it." Outside, the last sunlight glinted off the rows of parked Mustangs, their wings catching the light like polished silver. In that reflection, for the briefest instant, it was as if the entire sky bowed back. In acknowledgement, in memory, in silence. And somewhere beyond that horizon, where the war still thundered, a pilot banked hard through flak and cloud, and the wing held, steady, as a promise kept. By the time spring of 1945 reached California, victory was no longer a dream, but a slow, inevitable dawn. Newspapers printed numbers instead of headlines, thousands of sorties flown, hundreds of tanks destroyed, millions of tons of supplies moved. People talked of peace, like it was a shape appearing through fog. But for the men and women who had built that machinery, the end came not with celebration, but with a quiet, aching emptiness. The Inglewood plant fell silent one morning. No sirens, no shouting foremen, no engines roaring to life, just the slow echo of footsteps on concrete, and the smell, that unmistakable blend of metal dust and oil, already beginning to fade. Reeves stood near the drafting room, coat folded over one arm, watching the cleanup crews dismantle the ZAN jigs. Where there had once been fire and motion, now there was only stillness. The hangar lights hummed like bees in a vast hollow field. He turned toward the far wall, to the spot where Eli Turner's old desk had stood. For months, no one had touched it. Papers still lay where they'd been left. Sketches, measurements, a bent protractor. On one corner, half covered by a rag, sat a small tin cup filled with pencil shavings turned to gray dust. He picked it up, turning it slowly in his hand. Eli had disappeared sometime during the winter, without a word. No forwarding address, no resignation letter. A neighbor said they'd seen him boarding a train east, carrying a single leather case. Reeves had searched through the plant's records. Nothing. His name had been erased from payroll, as if it had never existed. But every time a new P-51 returned from Europe, the pilots spoke of something different. They said the plane felt alive, lighter in its turn, sharper in its climb. One described it as the only machine that seemed to know what I was thinking. Another swore he could feel it breathing when the clouds closed in. Reeves knew what they meant, even if they didn't. That wasn't design alone. That was a signature, buried deep within the metal, invisible but unbreakable. He set the tin down and walked toward the massive hangar doors. Outside, the wind carried a thin, far-away hum, like the sound of propellers turning miles above. It wasn't real, of course. The skies over Los Angeles were empty now. But for a moment, Reeves could almost imagine the shadow of a Mustang cutting across the clouds, banking gracefully, sunlight rippling off its wings. In that glimmer of imagination, the war hadn't yet ended. The sky still remembered. And far to the east, beyond the Atlantic, another kind of silence had fallen. The silence of aftermath. Europe lay wounded, cities smoldered, but over the ruins the contrails of Allied fighters still crossed like silver scars against the pale morning sky. One squadron, the 354th Fighter Group, flew its final escort mission that May. Their lead aircraft, a polished Mustang nicknamed Lucille, carried the same modified wing design Eli had drawn years before. The pilot, Captain Hal Donovan, later wrote in his diary, "When the Messerschmitts dived on us, I thought it was over. But the Mustang turned tighter than it ever had before. Like she'd been waiting for that moment her whole life." He never knew whose hand had made that possible. When the squadron returned to base, the ground crews gathered for photographs. Rows of smiling men beside the sleek silver planes that had carried them through hell. Behind them, faintly etched in sunlight, the wings curved in perfect harmony, catching the day like the pages of an unwritten book. Back in California, Reeves closed the hangar doors for the last time. As the metal clanged shut, the echo seemed to stretch far longer than it should have. Deep, hollow, almost like a heartbeat fading into distance. He looked once more toward the empty drafting table. The light from a nearby window fell across it, catching the edge of an old pencil mark still faintly visible on the surface. A single, sweeping line. The beginning of a wing. Reeves smiled to himself softly. "Good work, kid," he murmured. Then he turned off the lights. The factory sank into darkness, but outside the sunset burned the sky in shades of brass and red. The same colors as the machines they had once built to touch it. And if you listened closely, very closely, the wind still carried the whisper of a turning propeller, steady and eternal, somewhere beyond the clouds. Years slipped quietly into decades. The factory at Inglewood became a warehouse, then a parking lot, then nothing at all. Asphalt and glass rose over the places where molten aluminum once poured, and sparks once fell like snow. The world moved forward, to jets, to rockets, to satellites. But in that silent progress, the memory of 1,000 unnamed hands began to fade. Until one afternoon, long after the noise had gone, a young woman named Claire Turner arrived at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. She was an aeronautical engineer, quiet, precise, with the same dark hair and calm eyes as her grandfather. In her satchel, she carried something wrapped in oil-stained cloth. A sketch. Old, yellowed, drawn in graphite that had never quite lost its shine. It was a single curve, a wing. Perfectly balanced, perfectly human. She had found it in a trunk after her father passed away, along with a few rusted tools and a small photograph. A group of factory workers in coveralls, standing beside a half-built fuselage. On the back, in faded pencil, were just 3 words: "For when it flies." She showed the sketch to one of the curators, an older man who had spent his life cataloging machines of war. He turned it slowly under the light, tracing the curve with a trembling finger. "I've seen this before," he murmured. This was never officially recorded, but every P-51 that used this profile gained nearly 8% efficiency. It changed how they fought. He looked at her. "Who drew it?" She smiled faintly, not quite answering. someone who never stops dreaming. That evening, as the museum closed and the last visitors drifted out, Claire stood alone beneath the suspended silhouette of a restored Mustang. It hung there in the air like time itself, silent, weightless, eternal. The polished metal reflected the light in long, soft ribbons across the walls. She imagined her grandfather standing there decades before, pencil in hand, drawing that same curve on a scrap of paper. The hum of the factory around him, the taste of graphite, the steady rhythm of men and women who believed that even a line could change the course of a war. Outside, the world was quieter now, but some sounds never truly vanish. The wind still carried the faint echo of engines. Somewhere in the dark, a propeller turned once more. And for a moment, Claire thought she heard a voice, calm, distant, almost like a breath. Make it perfect this time. She looked up. The Mustang's wings caught the last light of the setting sun, and for a heartbeat, it seemed to move. A shimmer of motion, almost imperceptible, as if it were ready to take off once again. That night, as she left the museum, the city lights mirrored the stars, small, patient, endless. She thought of all those who had built something that outlived them. Welders, draftsmen, riveters, and quiet boys who once drew lines in the dark. Machines forget nothing. But neither does the sky. And somewhere, in that eternal space between sound and silence, between the wind and the memory of flight, the perfect wing was still turning, still holding, still remembering, still flying.